Now let's take a look at the economic role of geography. All right, the geography of the two countries and how that developed the economies in both countries. First, let's take a look at the United States and the conditions there. All right, so in the U.S., you have a large amount of arable land. All right, when I say arable land, I'm talking about land that is good for agriculture. There is a lot of land that is level, meaning that although there is mountainous territory, a lot of the land in the United States is level and is good for agriculture. Also, there is adequate rainfall in a lot of these areas, and so that's also good for agriculture. And so that will definitely be one of the strengths of the American economy, right? Agriculture, in addition to the industrial development that is taking place in the north. On top of having the land to develop crops, you also have waterways, a number of rivers, as well as the Atlantic Ocean, which are good for transporting the goods that are grown on these farms. All right, and so you have a lot of waterways and farmland that is close to these waterways. So basically, if you have farms, they develop their product, they can quickly get it loaded up onto ships on these rivers or in the Atlantic Ocean and be able to transport their goods to other areas. And this helps for connectivity, right? To help connect different parts of the United States so that they can sell their goods. And it also will connect the U.S. with other countries, right? Across the Atlantic, there's a strong demand for a lot of the agricultural products that are grown in the U.S., right? Particularly cotton. On top of this, on top of already having a lot of rivers and waterways, the United States will spend a lot of money in building its infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I'm talking about canals, road systems, railways, right? You have the invention of the railroad taking place around this time. And so all of that will help to connect the United States, right? All the different markets and the different regions of the United States, many of them will be connected now through this development of infrastructure. And that's very important, right? Because it makes it cheaper to ship your goods to other regions of the United States. And so you can make a bigger profit, and that helps the economy to grow overall. As I mentioned earlier, you have in the north the Industrial Revolution taking place. More and more factories are developing. You have a strong connection between farms that are in the areas of Ohio and the Great Lakes region that are shipping their goods using canals to the East Coast, particularly in New York. And so you have the East Coast and their economies connected with farmland and economies in the old Northwest or the Midwest, right? And so these different markets are getting closer and closer connected, and that helps for the growth of the economy, right? Some people are getting very rich during this time in the United States because of this. It also allows for regional crop specialization in the United States. What does this mean? It means that certain regions in the U.S. can focus on producing just one particular crop, right? Like, for example, in the Southeast, you have a focus on growing cotton, right? And so they can focus mainly on growing cotton. They don't have to grow all the different agricultural products to sustain that region. They can just grow one particular product that specializes in that area, right? Because of the land and the temperature and the climate. And then they could trade that product to other regions. And because there's such a good infrastructure in the United States, that means that they can trade with other regions and they can get other products that they don't have to grow it themselves, and it'll get there through that infrastructure, right? So infrastructure is huge in developing the economy in the U.S. during this time. And as I mentioned earlier, you have markets in Europe as well as islands in the Caribbean, which also are major markets for the United States. So the U.S. is able to really build its economy through trade with Europe and the Caribbean islands as well. Now in Mexico, they don't have a lot of these geographic benefits. For example, in Mexico, you don't have a huge amount of arable land, right? In some regions, there's a lot of mountains, right? So maybe the region will receive rainfall, but there's so many mountains there that it's not really good for growing crops. And then in other regions, when there's not a lot of mountains, there's not a lot of rainfall, right? They don't have sufficient amount of rainfall to really have an extensive agriculture in those areas. All right, so there's not a lot of arable land in Mexico. Most of the arable land in Mexico is located in the center of the country. And so that's a problem because the center of the country is not well connected. There's not a lot of waterways there. And so these farms are not able to quickly and easily load up their farm goods onto ships and transport it to other regions that would help with developing their economy. Right? On top of that, the infrastructure in Mexico is not in a good condition at this time. Many bridges were destroyed during the War for Independence, and a lot of roads were not in the best condition either at this time. So there's not a developed infrastructure in Mexico, and there's not a lot of waterways that could transport goods. And so that really hurts the connectivity of markets in Mexico, right? Complete opposite of what's taking place in the United States. Right? Okay, on top of this, you have a lot of regional markets in Mexico, meaning that a lot of goods that were produced in central Mexico tended to stay in those regions, right? They weren't having a lot of trade between the various different regions in Mexico. There was some, but not at the same level that's taking place in the United States. And so ultimately, that hurts economic development in Mexico, right? And so if you don't have a strong economy, it's really difficult to resist a more economically developed country like the United States when going to war with them.